All right, so picture this. You're scrolling through the news, right? And suddenly, boom, there's a headline about martial law being declared in South Korea. But wait, just a few hours later, poof, it's gone. Vanished. Like some kind of political flash mob. Seriously, what just happened?
Yeah, it's wild, right? What makes this so fascinating is that martial law isn't something you just casually toss around. You know, it completely upends the legal system, throws everything into chaos, and suddenly the military's calling the shots.
Right. It's a seismic shift, especially in a modern democracy like South Korea.
Absolutely. It's like hitting fast forward on some slow burn political thriller.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today on this deep dive.
Sure.
Why did South Korea seemingly out of nowhere declare martial law? Who are the key players in this like rapid fire political drama? And maybe most importantly, what does this whole thing tell us about the future of South Korean politics?
Big questions, right?
Big questions. We're going to be dissecting this whole thing based on excerpts from a document that lays it all out. Martiallaw.pdf. Straightforward title.
Straight to the point. No messing around.
So let's jump right in.
Okay.
Now you might be thinking, martial law. Hold on, hasn't South Korea moved past that? You'd be right. The last time they invoked martial law was way back in 1979 during a very different era.
Yeah, talk about a blast from the past, right. It was a time of authoritarian rule. So for it to reappear now, it's like a ghost from the past crashing a birthday party. It just doesn't compute.
Everyone's like, wait, what?
Total shock.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the public's reaction, because I know I wasn't the only one glued to the news feeds as this whole thing unfolded. Protests erupted almost immediately, right?
Oh, absolutely. And we're not talking about small gatherings either. These were massive demonstrations organized mainly by student groups and civil society organizations. They took to the streets, surrounded government buildings, demanding answers, demanding accountability. It was intense.
So it wasn't just politicians in an uproar.
Yeah.
This really struck a nerve with everyday people.
It did. And you can understand why. For a lot of South Koreans, especially those who lived through those turbulent years of authoritarian rule,
Yeah.
you know, martial law brings back some really dark memories, a sense of fear, uncertainty.
Like a flashback to a time when basic freedoms were suppressed when speaking out could get you in serious trouble.
Exactly. And that's what makes the speed and intensity of the public's reaction even more understandable. They're not just reacting to a news headline, they're reacting to a very real and sensitive part of their history.
It's like this declaration ripped open a wound that many thought had healed.
Yeah, a wound that runs deep.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit and lay out the timeline, because this all happened so fast. It was like a political whirlwind. On the evening of December 3rd, President Yoon Yeol drops this bombshell. He declares martial law, citing threats from pro-North Korean anti-state forces.
Okay, wait, stop right there. That phrase, pro-North Korean anti-state forces, that's where things get a little murky. You see, that term is often used in South Korean politics, but it's a broad brush, and some argue a dangerous one.
How so?
Well, it can be used to label anyone who criticizes the government, anyone who expresses even a hint of sympathy towards North Korea. It's like a catch-all phrase to silence dissent.
So using that term to justify martial law immediately raised a lot of eyebrows.
A lot of eyebrows, a lot of red flags, too. People were like, hold on, is this really about national security or something else going on here?
So even the language used in the declaration was a signal that something wasn't quite right. Almost like a way to silence any opposition.
And that's a slippery slope, right? Once you start restricting freedoms in the name of security, where do you draw the line? That's what a lot of people were worried about.
It's like opening a Pandora's box.
Exactly. And that's why the response from opposition parties was so swift and so fierce. They immediately accused Yoon of overreaching, of attempting a power grab, of trying to stifle dissent under the guise of national security.
Like they saw right through it.
They did. And remember, even some members of Yoon's own party weren't on board with this. They publicly voiced their concerns, which suggests that this wasn't some carefully planned strategy. This was more like a unilateral decision, maybe even impulsive.
Like he just snapped and said, martial law it is.
Yeah, it adds another layer of complexity to this whole situation. It makes you wonder what was going through Yoon's head. What was his end game? Was this a calculated move or an act of desperation?
It's a puzzle.
Oh,
right.
oh.
So let's try to piece it together. Let's delve into the possible motivations behind this. Because it seems like Yoon was facing a perfect storm of political challenges before this whole martial law episode, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, his approval ratings were plummeting, there were allegations of misconduct swirling around him, and the National Assembly was becoming increasingly hostile.
Like he was surrounded.
Exactly. It was like he was trapped in a political pressure cooker and things were about to explode.
So you have a president facing mounting pressure from all sides, seemingly out of options. And then, boom, martial law, enter the military. The ultimate display of force. I mean, was this a desperate attempt to regain control? To silence his critics? Like, hey, everyone, quiet down. The military's here.
It's a theory a lot of analysts are considering. You have to remember, South Korean politics, it's a highly charged arena,
Oh, man.
The ruling and opposition parties have been locked in this bitter power struggle for years, and this martial law declaration, it just poured gasoline on an already raging fire.
Just threw a match on it.
Exactly.
And it seems this wasn't just some political posturing either. This was the real deal.
Yeah.
Our sources indicate that the military was actually deployed to the National Assembly building.
Wow.
Can you imagine that? Soldiers
Yeah.
standing guard outside the very heart of South Korean democracy.
It's a chilling image. It really is. And one that sent chills down the spines of many South Koreans. It's a visual reminder of how fragile democracy really is, how quickly things can change.
Yeah, in the blink of an eye.
Ex-
So for a few tense hours, it seemed like South Korea was teetering on the brink. What happened next? How did they pull back from the edge?
Well, it seems cooler heads prevailed in the end. There was intense pressure from international bodies, allies like the United States. They were urging restraint. And within South Korea itself, the backlash was overwhelming.
Oh, that.
Not just from the public and opposition parties, but from within Yoon's own party, from business leaders, from influential figures across society. Everyone was basically saying, whoa, 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 this is not okay.
Like pump the brakes.
Exactly.
So it was this combination of internal and external pressure that forced Yoon to back down.
Precisely. And to his credit, he did eventually rescind the martial law declaration, less than 24 hours after it was issued. But the damage was already done. The genie was out of the bottle, and now South Korea is left grappling with the aftermath of this political earthquake.
Yeah, trying to pick up the pieces.
It's going to take some time to recover from this.
Okay, so let's talk about that fallout. What are the potential consequences for President Yoon? Could he actually be removed from office?
Well, the opposition is certainly pushing for that. They've initiated impeachment proceedings, accusing Yoon of abusing his power, of violating the Constitution.
Whoa.
It's a big deal.
So they're not messing around.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't impeachment a long shot? I mean,
Yeah.
it's not exactly easy to remove a sitting president, right?
True, it's certainly not a straightforward process.
There's a lot of hurdles.
A lot of hurdles. For starters, they need to secure a two-thirds majority in the National Assembly to even pass an impeachment motion.
That's a high bar.
It is.
Like,
And even if they manage that, the case then goes to the Constitutional Court, which has the final say.
so it all comes down to the Constitutional Court. And
Yeah.
from what I understand, that court isn't exactly known for its speed.
Right. You're right. The wheels of justice in South Korea, they tend to turn slowly.
It's like watching molasses in January.
And in this case, it's even more complicated because the court currently has several vacancies, which could further delay the process.
So we're talking months, if not years.
Poten-
Okay? So while impeachment is a possibility, it's not a certainty. And it could drag on for a while. What about other legal ramifications? Could Yoon face criminal charges for this?
That's another avenue that's being explored. Some legal experts argue that declaring martial law under these circumstances could be construed as a criminal act.
Yeah.
An abuse of power.
Even treason.
Treason.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Yep.
It's a serious accusation.
It is a very serious charge. And it's unlikely that prosecutors would pursue it lightly.
Yeah.
But the fact that it's even being discussed shows just how seriously people are taking this whole situation.
So Yoon's facing this potential legal minefield. And on top of that, he's dealing with a deeply divided country, a public that's lost trust in his leadership. What options does he have at this point?
Well, there's always the option of resignation. He could choose to step down to save face, to allow the country to move on and start healing.
But wouldn't that be seen as an admission of guilt? Like, okay, I messed up, I'm out of here.
Not necessarily. It could be framed as a selfless act, putting the country's interests above his own. It could be a way to de-escalate the situation, to prevent further political turmoil.
It would definitely be a dramatic move, and one that would have far-reaching consequences for South Korean politics. But from what we've seen of Yoon so far, he doesn't strike me as someone who gives up easily.
Yeah, he's definitely shown a certain stubbornness.
He's a fighter. He's determined to stay the course.
He's definitely given that impression. He's shown a willingness to take bold, even reckless actions. He's a bit of a wild card, and that makes him unpredictable, even dangerous.
So we have a president clinging to power, facing impeachment, possible criminal charges, and a public that's largely turned against him. What does this all mean for the future of South Korea? Where do they go from here?
Well, the stakes are incredibly high right now. This whole incident has exposed some deep cracks in South Korean society. In its political system, there's this growing sense of disillusionment with the political elite, a feeling that the system is rigged against ordinary people.
Like the average person doesn't stand a chance.
Exactly. And that's a dangerous sentiment, right?
Absolutely.
When people lose faith in their institutions and their leaders, that's when things can really start to unravel. That's when you see extremism, populism, authoritarianism start to take root.
It's like a breeding ground for chaos.
It can be. So this martial law episode, it wasn't just a blip on the radar. It was a warning sign, a wake-up call.
Like a shot across the bow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What happens next in South Korea is going to be fascinating to watch and potentially very consequential for the entire region.
The whole world's watching.
They are, because South Korea is at a crossroads. And the choices it makes in the coming weeks and months will determine its trajectory for years to come.
It's crazy, right? It feels like we've been talking about a political thriller, not a real-life event in a country that's usually known for its stability.
Yeah.
This martial law thing, even though it was short-lived, it's really thrown everything into disarray.
Yeah, it's left everyone reeling a bit, like, what just happened?
Exactly. So where do things go from here? What are the possible paths forward for South Korea?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer is, it's complicated. There are a few different scenarios that play out, each with its own set of challenges and potential consequences.
Okay, so let's break those down. What are the most likely scenarios we could see unfold?
Well, one possibility, as we've discussed, is impeachment. The opposition is really pushing for this, and depending on how things go with the Constitutional Court, it could actually lead to Yoon being removed from office.
Wow, that would be huge. A complete shakeup.
It would be a major turning point for sure, and it would likely trigger a whole new wave of political turmoil.
So a lot hinges on this Constitutional Court, which, as you mentioned, isn't exactly known for its speed. Is there anything that could speed up the process in this case?
Public pressure could definitely play a role. The protests we saw in response to the martial law declaration, those were a clear indication of how angry and frustrated people are.
People were not happy.
Not at all. And if those protests continue to grow, if they become more organized and more vocal, it could put pressure on the court to expedite the impeachment proceedings.
So people power could be a factor here. Interesting. What other scenarios are on the table?
Another possibility is that Yoon weathers the storm. You know, he manages to cling to power maybe by making some concessions to his opponents, maybe by using his executive authority to push through some unpopular measures.
So basically doubling down.
In a way, it's not impossible, but it would require a pretty significant shift in his strategy and a willingness to compromise, which is something he hasn't really demonstrated so far.
Yeah, he seems pretty set in his ways.
He does. Okay.
So let's say Yoon does manage to stay in power despite this whole crisis. What would that mean for South Korea? What would be the implications?
Well, it would likely lead to a period of prolonged political instability. The divisions that have been exposed by this crisis, those wouldn't just vanish overnight. They would probably deepen and fester, creating a climate of distrust and resentment.
Like a wound that never heals.
Exactly. And that could spill over into other areas of South Korean society, too.
Oh, I bet. Like the economy, for example.
Exactly. We're already seeing signs of that. Investors are getting nervously. Businesses are hesitant to make long-term commitments. This political uncertainty, it could have a really chilling effect on the South Korean economy. And that would have ripple effects throughout the entire region.
So the stakes are incredibly high. Not just for South Korea, but for its neighbors as well.
For everyone, really.
This whole episode has really highlighted how interconnected everything is. Global politics, global economics, it's all tied together.
It really is. It's a powerful reminder that events in one country can have far-reaching consequences, and that even seemingly stable democracies can be vulnerable to these sudden shifts in power.
It's a bit unsettling when you think about it.
It is.
Well, this deep dive has been quite a journey. We started with what seemed like a pretty straightforward event, a martial law declaration. But as we peeled back the layers, we uncovered this complex web of political maneuvering, public outrage, historical echoes, and potential consequences that go way beyond South Korea's borders. What's your main takeaway from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that democracy, it's fragile. You know, it requires constant vigilance, a commitment to dialogue, and a willingness to compromise. And even when all of those things are present, there's still no guarantee that democracy will prevail.
That's a sobering thought.
It is.
As we've seen in South Korea, things can change quickly, and the choices made by leaders, by institutions, by everyday citizens, those choices can have a huge impact on the course of history.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this lingering sense of unease. Like what happened in South Korea, it could happen anywhere. It's a reminder to stay informed, to stay engaged, and to never take our democratic freedoms for granted. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been quite a ride.
Absolutely. It's been fascinating and a little bit scary, too.
Definitely a lot to think about.